Okay, so welcome back. This is part 2 in our series where we discuss some ways that we can measure the performance of our computer hardware, our motherboard, our CPU, and specifically we're looking at the graphics processor, the GPU, and how we can measure its performance and what is some of the free software out there that allow us to do it. And we looked at some of the pros and cons of some of that free software, and we realized, hey, you know, what that software is doing, we could do very easily by writing our own software. And what we developed is what you see here, this application, which allows us to take data measured by another free application called GPU-Z. And it basically measures the performance of our GPU over a period of time and saves each measurement in a file, so that we can go and in this application we can load that file and plot it. And you can see here we've got performance of our GPU as it's doing some rendering for a few minutes. And here's a chart of 4 different performance graphs. One of them is on top. You see GPU temperature in degrees C, maximum of 66.7 and minimum is 38.3. We're also measuring GPU load, going from 0 to 90%. How much power in watts is drawn by the board, and also what's called a performance cap reason. And we can chart that. It automatically loads that file and charts it. And we can also select and deselect some of the traces so we can look at them individually. And what we talked about in the first video, and I encourage you to take a look, is what's this all about? How's it laid out? And what's that other software? How does it work? And now what we're going to do in this video is we're going to look at the C# application that we can use to build this application that you see here. And we're going to show you how you can do it very, very easily. And also I encourage you to look at the previous videos on this channel where we talk about various aspects of writing a simple C# application and doing charts and file parsing and all the things that we're going to need to build this application. So let's jump into Visual Studio C# Windows Forms application and see how this is all laid out. So here is our C# Visual Studio Windows Forms application. And what we've done is we've added a bunch of controls to this Form 1. Now I encourage you, if you don't know what I'm talking about, look at some of the previous videos in this channel. We talk about all the different aspects of this. We've only got a few controls here. We've got, in the middle here, we've got a chart. So all we have to do is go into the toolbox and go down to data and drag and drop a chart. And then we've got this blue square here, this rectangle is called a panel, and it's holding some check boxes and also a bunch of labels. And these check boxes are what you saw before. They just allow you to select and deselect which traces we can show in the graph. And we've got minimum and maximum labels. You can see there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 2 for the name and 2 for the actual value for each trace. So that's pretty easy. You just drag and drop a panel, and then on top of it, 4 check boxes and like 16 labels, and just name them as appropriate, and we'll show you how to set those up later. So we've got our chart, we've got our labels, we've got our panel. Down here we've got a text box. I'm using a rich text box that allows you to change colors of the text and some other things. We did a video on rich text boxes before. I encourage you to take a look at that. Then we've got this button, open file, and then an exit button. And then we've got 2 more labels down here that are initially blank, and they provide a readout of the name of the file that we're going to open and also the date that the file is going to have a date inside of it, and it's going to tell us what the date is. And basically all we have to do is, once we've got these loaded, we have to generate event handlers for this open file button. You just double click and that will do the open file. And then each of these checkboxes, we need to double click on them, and that will generate event handlers for whenever we check or uncheck any of these text boxes. It will go to an event handler and we can write some code to disable and enable the corresponding trace. And then of course double click on the exit button, and that will give us the exit event handler. And that's about it. The only other thing we have to do is, what I've done is on this chart, select it, and I have set up 4 series. The way this is laid out, it will chart a maximum of 4 traces or 4 series. You can modify that, but this is set up for 4, and it'll be easy to add to it in the future, but I'll just show you how to do 4. So we'll select the chart and then go into the series down here in the properties. You can see it's a collection, and all I did is I hit add 3 times. It starts out with series 1, and I added series 2, 3, and 4. Just hit add 3 times, and now it's set up with 4 series, and we can go through and we can populate those. So that's about it for the user interface. Of course, we're going to have a lot of charts set up and some parsing, but we'll look at that next. So here's our Form 1. Now, one thing I've added is a class called trace. And this will make it a lot easier. We're going to have, in this case, 4 traces. If we pull in a file with 4 different series or 4 different traces, and this will be a class, and we can instantiate it each time we have a trace, and it will have, for example, the Y values, the values of each reading, and it will be a list of doubles, Y vowels, and that's how we can take the list of doubles and apply them to our chart to draw the graph. So each trace has a Y values, and then it's also got a name, right? We saw in the CSV file, each trace has a name, and it also has some units. We're going to parse the name field because it's got some units like degrees centigrade or percent, and we're going to pull that out. And then we're going to calculate the max and min of that trace when we've read it all in. And this just makes it easy to have a container for a trace. So on our project, we right-click, add new class, and say public class trace, and we're all set. Otherwise, this is the application. And it's set up the way I normally do. I've got regions where I've got documentation, to-do list, parameters, Form 1, the standard initialized component. And as usual, if I'm going to be working on a chart, I generally have a method that just sets up the chart. Make sure it's a line graph and sets all the parameters. And then I'm going to have an initialize UI where it starts out making some labels invisible and does some other UI, sets some defaults. So that's going to be a couple methods here in the methods. And then we've got a region of methods and then a region of event handlers. So the methods, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. One method, like we said, to configure the chart and initialize the UI. That'll be right here. And here's the big worker where it parses the CSV file and gets all the data we need to actually do the charting. And then we're going to have a parse header string array. We showed in the CSV file from GPU-Z that there's a header, and we're reading that in as a string, and then we have to parse the date and the 2 values, the names of the 2 values. And that's what this does. It just parses. It takes an input array, a string array, and parses it using the comma delimiter and gets us the values of the names of the traces. And then we're going to assign traces to axes. Now, when we do this, we're going to have the ability for this chart to have 2 y-axes called a primary and a secondary. And I did a series on charts in C#. I encourage you to take a look at that if you're not sure what that is. But what we can do is we can have, say we've got 4 values, 4 traces that we're charting. If we can break those 4 into 2 types, for example, 2 of them are temperatures in degrees centigrade, and the other 2 are percentage, like how much the GPU is loaded, we can put all the percentages on one axis and the temperatures on the other axis. So we can chart all 4 of these. 2 of them go for one axis and the other 2 go for the other axis. So that's the purpose of this method. Basically saying, hey, trace, are you a temperature reading? If so, I'll put you on the temperature y-axis. Are you a percentage reading? If so, I'll put you on a percentage y-axis, and so on. So that just allows you to clean up your chart and make it a little bit easier to see. And then the last method is to actually chart the data. So we've read it in, we've parsed it, we've made lists of data, and now we just have to give that to the charts to chart it. So we'll go through those in a bit. And then the event handlers, we've got the open file button and we've got the exit button. And the other four are what I talked about before when we select and deselect the checkboxes to enable or show or disable the different traces, these four traces. We've got the event handlers, and then we can just enable and disable as appropriate. And that's the basic layout of this, pretty simple. So let's go through the using statements, using systems, system collections.generic, because we're going to have lists of data, system drawing, since we're doing charts, system IO, system link, language integrated query, so we can do some of the parsing of the file, system.text for modifying the text, Windows Forms, and Windows Forms data visualization charting, of course, for the charts. And that's it for the using. First, let's take a look at the parameters. There's not many. The file lines array, what we're going to do is when we read in the file, do a open file dialog and read the file, it's going to read all of the lines as an array of strings. So this is going to be the entire contents of the file, the CSV file, as an array of strings. And then we can use that to parse. A Boolean is date set. That's what we're going to use to grab data from the first reading and populate that label that says what date was this file, the starting date. And once we've got that done, we can set this to true so we don't re-update the label. And then log date, that's the date that we're going to grab. We're going to convert it into a date time, call it log date, and display it. And then here is the list of date time, which is xvals. So each, as we mentioned before, each reading is going to have this date. We're going to convert to a date time, and then we're going to extract the hours, minutes, and seconds for each reading, each one of these, so that we can display it in the chart. And that list of date time values is the xvals, basically the time values. Then we're going to have a list of traces. In our case, the maximum is going to be 4 traces, and it's basically taking that trace class, instantiating it, so that we can populate them as we read them in. And then we're going to have a list of colors, system drawing.color, that we can specify for each trace what are the associated colors, the colors of the lines, of the labels, and that. So we're going to say list of color, trace colors is new list of color. You can put whatever colors you want. I've got blue for the first trace, red, dark green, and black. So you can modify those if you want. And then we've got a list of string called trace names. Again, that is just the list of these names without the date. So in this case, it's going to be 2 trace names, temperature and load. And that's the list of trace names. And then what we're going to do is further parse those. You can see it's a name plus a measurement unit like degree C or percent. We're also going to parse those measurement units for future use. And we're going to put that in trace units as a list of string. And then we're going to convert the file lines to a list of string and call it file lines list. There's going to be a lot of work in the chart, and I'm not going to go through in detail. I'll show you the code. You can pause and copy it if you want. You can set it up however you want. But basically, we're going to do initialize UI. And you can see for all of the checkboxes, I've called them checkbox trace 1, trace 2, trace 3, and trace 4. And what I'm doing is I'm setting the color of the checkbox label, the color, the 4 color, equal to the appropriate trace colors like we defined before, these trace colors. So we're saying checkbox 1 is going to be trace color 0, which is blue, and so on. And we did that for each of the checkboxes. And then we're going to default it as checked, but we're going to make it invisible when we start up the application because we haven't even read in the file yet. So we're going to say it's checked, but we're going to make it invisible. We do the same for all the other checkboxes. Choose the color, make it default as checked, and then visible equals false. And these are all the labels associated with the minimum and maximum values. all of these we're going to make the label .visible equals false until we read in the file. So that's the initialize UI, just the checkboxes and the labels, and then the configure chart. Now we've gone through this many times in other videos. I've set these up to first set up the axis X, the label format, label style.format, hours, minutes, and seconds. As you saw, we want to have, we grab the hours, minutes, and seconds from each X value. And then we're going to choose a font of Arial 12, and then an X-axis minor grid interval equals 1, and a minor grid enabled equals true. So that just sets up the X-axis format. And now we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 series, the ones that we already added when we selected the chart and added more series. And now we just have to set it up. We're going to do the same thing. The X value type is chart value type.datetime. We do that for the same for all series. Series chart type.line, the same for all series. Border width or the line width is 3, the same for all. And then we again use the trace colors, 0 for the border color, which is the line color, and then 0, 1, 2, 3. So setting it up is all identical for all series. And then the last thing, we have to set up the left-hand axis or the y-axis and the right-hand axis or the y2 axis. We're going to say axis y round axis values. We're going to say axis y is started from 0 equals false. We don't want it to automatically go from 0 because it might just, the range might be from 70 to 90, so there's no reason to start it at 0. The fore color for the label on axis Y is blue. The font is Arial 14, and the same for Y2 is started from 0 is false. Fore color is orange. The font is Arial 14, and the major grid line color is gray. We want the right-hand Y2 axis, the grid lines, to be a lot lighter than the left hand so they don't get too confusing. You can do however you want, but this basically sets up the chart. We also cleared all the chart legends. We don't want any legends. And that's about it for setting up the chart. So we've set up the UI and the chart. Now, the first thing that's going to happen is we're going to have the button open file. And it's very simple. We're going to do an open file dialog. OFD, we're going to call it OFD as a new open file dialog, and the dialog result is OFD.showDialog. So at this point it's showing the dialog, waiting for the user to select. If the result is dialog result equals OK, then the string file, we're getting the file name, the OFD file name selected by the user, and that's a string called file, and we are taking that name and sending it to the label file name.text to tell the user, hey, you just opened this file, and that's the string. And then we're going to read the entire file into an array of strings, and by specifying encoding default, it will correctly read and display the degrees character, which is correctly displayed in the incoming CSV log file. This is really important. You're going to get in the file, you can see up here, degrees C. That degrees is not going to be read correctly unless you have encoding.default. So very important. So we'll do a file read all lines and into the file name that we already grabbed and encoding.default, and that will give us a string array called file lines array. So every line is one element in this string array. Then we're going to go and do all the work, parse the CSV file and then chart the resulting data. So here's the parse CSV file. I commented some stuff out I'm not using. I'm saying double val equals 0, and that's kind of an input value. And basically this method operates on the string array that we just brought in, file lines array, where each array element contains one line of the CSV input file. With the first line as a header containing the names of each trace, it generates the xvals, yvals 1, and yvals 2 lists of doubles for charting. So the open file button generated a string array of all lines of the input file. First, convert that array to a list of strings. So we're taking file lines array and converting that to a list, and we get file lines list, which is a list of strings. So it went from an array into a list of lines in the file. Now we have to parse each line in that list. starting with the first line, which will give us some of the header data. So we parse the first line, which contains the header info, into a string array based on the comma delimiter. After parsing, the header string array should look like this. So we'd have date, and they have a bunch of spaces before and after we're going to have to deal with. And then, for example, GPU space temperature space degrees C. I didn't show the degrees, but it's degrees C with a space after. And then GPU load with a space. And also there could be an empty element. So we're going to have to deal with that too. So this is a case where you really got to know exactly what's in the data that you're bringing in so you know how to clean it all up. So we're going to have to get rid of these spaces. We're going to have to get rid of an empty line if it exists. So we're going to do a file lines list. This is the 0th or the first element in the list of file lines. We're going to do a split based on the comma delimiter, and that will give a string array of these, in this case, 4 values, one of which is not of any use. So we're going to have that array with these values. Now we remove the first header line for the list containing all the lines since it's no longer needed. We've already got that. We've grabbed the header array. So now we can remove that date element because all we need now is the reading names. So file line list.remove at 0. It removes this 0th element. And then we can parse the string array, header string array. And that's another method that will basically take that, just the header line, and parse it. We'll look at that in a bit. So now that we have our file lines list minus the header, we can step through each string S in that list and we can parse it. Okay, so that's about it for this one. Sort of getting long. Most people don't watch past the first 60 seconds of my videos, apparently. So in the next video, what we're going to do is we're going to pick up where we left off with the C# code and show you what's left of the C# code so that you can develop an application like this. And in the video after that, we're going to do some real-world analysis, as you see here, where I am actually using the software to analyze my GPU performance. And in this case, we are doing some renders, 3D renders in Blender. And this is over a period of 9 minutes or so, doing a render and looking at the GPU temperature and the load on the GPU and the fan speed, and trying to get a real good idea about what's going on with the different components over time as we render it. We'll also be talking about things like performance cap, where you can get some printouts from GPU-Z of what is limiting the performance, if anything, during your usage of the GPU. We'll explain what all that is. So if you're liking these videos, I encourage you to hit the like button, subscribe, hit the bell notifications. But most of all, please let others know that we're here so we get some views. Really appreciate it. Otherwise, take care. Have a really good day. Thanks.